The smell of stale coffee lingered. The TV in the sunroom buzzed low, voices fading in and out. Cold air slipped through the cracked window. Margaret sat stiff, sipping tea, watching me like a bug. Daniel's voice cut sharp. "You embarrassed me again, Claire. In front of everyone." His hand gripped my arm, fingers digging deep. I pulled back, but the hallway felt narrow, closing in. The framed photo, our wedding, slipped. Glass shattered on the hardwood. He shoved me. Not a slap, not a punch, just force. Enough to steal my breath. My knees hit the floor. Margaret's smirk grew wide. "Finally?" she whispered, voice like ice. "Some discipline in this house." Her words stung worse than the fall. 3 years of their judgment, their cold eyes. Every insult cut deeper than Daniel's shove. I tasted copper. My lips split. The air smelled of lavender from her old sunroom diffuser. That scent always felt fake. Sweet over something rotten. Daniel straightened his shirt, calm again. "Maybe now you'll stay quiet at dinners." My fingers trembled as I touched the broken frame. Our faces, smiling, now split by shards. Was this love? Or had I been blind this whole time? Then, the front door creaked open. Measured boots on the wooden floor. 3 shadows stretched long down the hallway. I knew that sound. Every step carried weight, control. "Claire." A steady voice called. My father's voice. Retired Colonel Mark Hensley. 2 uniformed officers behind him, silent, statuesque. Margaret's cup rattled. Daniel froze mid-step. My father's eyes swept the room. Cold, calm, sharp. They landed on my bruised face, my shaking hands. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The air itself held still. His words came slow. "Are you hurt?" I tried to answer, but the lump in my throat blocked sound. My hand pressed the floor, steadying myself. My father's gaze shifted to Daniel. "Son," he said quietly, "we need to talk." The room felt colder. Margaret's smirk finally faded. Daniel's jaw tightened, but he stepped back. For the first time, silence favored me. "Would you fight back, or walk away? Tell me below." The air smelled different back then. Wood smoke, fallen leaves, and cinnamon tea. My small rental house sat on a quiet street in Charlottesville. It felt safe. It felt mine. I'd wake before sunrise. Lesson plans spread across the oak table, papers rustling softly. The heater clanked every morning, like an old friend saying hello. I didn't mind. I was alone, but I wasn't lonely. Students filled my days with noise and purpose. They'd call out questions, leave notes on my desk. Some drew little sketches of my cat Penny. Their kindness felt real. I thought that was enough. Every Friday, I'd drive to Dad's. His old house near Burke still smelled of cedar and coffee. He'd brew a pot, sit at the kitchen table, listening more than talking. Sometimes we wouldn't say much. Sometimes that was all I needed. The quilt always hung on the back of his chair. My grandmother's stitches, soft but strong. I'd run my hand across the faded squares, tracing the stories they held. One square still carried a faint scent of lavender soap. It calmed me every time. Then came Daniel. Tall, charming, confident. He built houses, talked about stability, security, a future together. I believed him. Goodness, I wanted to believe him. We spent weekends at open houses. Margaret tagged along more than I liked. She'd run her hand along countertops, clicking her tongue. "This one is beneath you, Daniel," she'd say. I should have noticed the warning then. I let go of my rental. Packed up Penny, my books, the quilt. Moved into their red brick home in Fairfax. The first night, I heard the wind whistle through the gaps in the old windows. It didn't sound welcoming. Margaret's perfume filled every hallway. Floral, heavy, like it was hiding something sour. She told me where to store my quilt. "In the attic," she said. "It doesn't fit the decor." I told myself it didn't matter. It was just a quilt. It was just a house. But deep down, something shifted. The place didn't feel mine anymore. The fireplace barely worked that winter. Margaret said it wasted gas, so she kept it cold. The room smelled faintly of fake roses. Not the real kind, but the dusty, plastic kind. I missed cedar and wood smoke. She rearranged the kitchen within a week. Spices in glass jars, labels facing outward. Presentation matters, she said, tapping a polished nail on the counter. Even my coffee mugs were too mismatched. She boxed them up without asking. Daniel nodded along. He said she meant well. She just wants us to look put together, Claire. But he spent longer hours at work, later nights. Our dinners turned silent, filled only with the hum of the fridge. She chose my clothes, too. One morning, I found a Nordstrom bag on the bed. Inside, a cream dress, no tags. Margaret stood in the doorway. Your school clothes are plain. Wear this for dinner. I stared at the fabric. It felt stiff, foreign, nothing like me. Still, I slipped it on, telling myself it was easier. Daniel complimented it once, then said nothing the rest of the night. The lights in that house always felt harsh. Bright overhead fixtures, no warm lamps. Evenings, I'd sit alone in the den, quilt gone, Penny asleep by my feet. The TV droned, volume low, voices blurred. I felt like a guest, not a wife. Margaret filled the space with noise. Phone calls to her club, her bridge group, endless chatter. She'd glance at me sometimes, eyes sharp, like I'd interrupted her world. Daniel rarely noticed. Or maybe he pretended not to. I started waking at 3 a.m. The air felt heavy. Quiet except for the hum of the heater. I'd sit on the couch, wrapped in my coat, staring at the empty hallway. My chest felt tight, my hands cold. I told myself this was just marriage. One night, I reached for my phone. Scrolled through old photos of my rental, the oak table, the quilt. The heater's clank, the cinnamon tea. They felt like someone else's memories. And I couldn't decide if I wanted them back. Some afternoons, I'd drive to Burke. Dad's house hadn't changed much. The porch smelled of coffee grounds and pine needles. His old rocking chair still creaked with every shift of weight. It always felt steadier than my own home. He'd pour 2 cups of coffee. Strong, dark, the way he liked it. Steam curled in the cool air, the scent warm and grounding. We'd sit at his kitchen table, silent at first. Sometimes, silence was easier than words. His pen scratched across a notepad. Old habits from the service. He liked to write things down, every plan, every detail. I'd watch his hand move steady, deliberate. There was comfort in his calm. One evening, I finally spoke. I don't feel like myself anymore. Dad. The words surprised me, even as they left my mouth. He set his pen down, looked straight at me. His eyes were sharp but gentle. Claire, he said, his voice low, steady. Respect isn't optional. Not in a marriage, not anywhere. He sipped his coffee, eyes still on mine. If someone chips away at you long enough, you stop noticing. Until there's nothing left. His words lingered. I stared at the fading quilt draped over his chair. The stitches felt like armor, each one a reminder of who I'd been. I wanted to take it back to Fairfax, but Margaret had banned it. It clashes, she'd said. Dad didn't push me for answers. He never did. Instead, he placed his notepad in front of me. On it, a simple line. You choose how they treat you. I traced the ink with my finger, the letters cold but steady. Driving back that night, the streets felt longer, emptier. Fairfax lights flickered like distant stars, cold and distant. Margaret's perfume hit as soon as I opened the door. Daniel was asleep on the couch, TV glow on his face. I felt like a shadow in my own home. In the mirror that night, I barely recognized the woman staring back. The dress, the makeup, the tired eyes. I whispered to the reflection, Who are you now? The house stayed silent, offering no answer. For the first time, I wasn't sure I had one. The ballroom lights were too bright. Cold white beams glared off every glass surface. The scent of heavy perfume, Margaret's favorite, clung to the air. It mixed with the metallic tang of polished silverware. My stomach tightened before anyone even spoke. Daniel walked 2 steps ahead. Always 2, like I was tagging along. He adjusted his cufflinks, didn't look back. Margaret stayed at his side, shoulders square. Her pearls glimmered under the light. The chatter around us hummed low. Glasses clinked, forks scraped china. Laughter rose and fell in quick bursts. I stayed quiet, my palms damp against my skirt. I told myself, a smile, just get through tonight. As Margaret didn't wait long, she leaned toward a group near the buffet. Her voice carried, sharp and clear. My dear Claire, still teaching those little classes? Not exactly a contribution, is it? The laughter stung before I even heard it. A man in a gray suit chuckled softly. Daniel's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He sipped his drink, eyes fixed on the far wall. I felt every eye glance my way. Heat climbed my neck. I opened my mouth, then stopped. Part of me wanted to defend myself. Part of me wanted to disappear. My fingers gripped the clutch in my lap. Margaret turned to another guest. She spends her afternoons with teenagers, bless her heart. Daniel provides. She manages. Her tone dripped with fox sweetness. The pearls on her neck looked like tiny chains. My chest ached, a heavy pull. Each word she spoke chipped away at something inside. I remembered Dad's note, the inked line. You choose how they treat you. But in that room, I felt powerless. The scent of wine hit strong as a waiter passed. The sound of a dropped fork cut through the murmur. I blinked hard, swallowing against the lump in my throat. Daniel glanced at me once, then looked away like nothing was wrong. Margaret's smile grew wider. You must feel lucky, Claire. A home like Daniel's. Most women your age would settle. The words slid under my skin like ice. I forced a breath, steady but shallow. The ballroom blurred for a moment. Voices faded, lights seemed harsher. I felt like I was standing outside myself, watching a stranger shrink smaller and smaller. And then, Margaret raised her glass again. Margaret raised her glass higher. Her smile never touched her eyes. To Daniel, she said loudly, for carrying this family's weight. Not everyone can afford a spouse who enjoys hobbies instead of real work. A ripple of polite chuckles followed. Each sound felt like a pinprick. Daniel tilted his glass, silent, his gaze fixed on a painting. He didn't look at me once. I wondered if he even heard. My throat tightened. I wanted to speak, to slice through her words. But my voice felt trapped, heavy, buried under 3 years of silence. I gripped my clutch tighter, nails biting into my palm. The ballroom felt smaller, air heavier. Margaret turned toward me, still smiling. Claire, dear. Why don't you share your latest school project? I'm sure everyone could use a light story tonight. Her tone dripped with mockery. Every guest's head seemed to turn. My lips parted, but nothing came. Every eye, every light, every clink of glass pressed down. I forced a weak smile. Oh, just the usual, I said softly. My words sounded foreign, brittle. Daniel's phone buzzed. He stepped back, murmuring to a colleague by the door. Not a glance my way. Not even when Margaret's laugh sliced the air. She leaned close enough for only me to hear. See, this is why you'll never fit, she whispered. Daniel deserves someone polished. Someone who knows her place. Her perfume, heavy and floral, filled my nose. I fought the urge to pull away. My chest ached, my hands trembling. Then, a voice, low but clear, from across the table. Mrs. Brooks, I think teaching is a real contribution. It was a woman I hadn't met, maybe mid-50s, sharp suit. Her eyes met mine for a moment, calm and steady. Margaret blinked, caught off guard. Her smile faltered for half a second. The woman continued. Education builds communities. Some would call it essential. Her tone stayed polite but firm. Heat rose to my face, a mix of gratitude and shame. Someone had noticed. Someone had dared to counter Margaret. I opened my mouth, searching for words. But Daniel stepped back into the circle. His voice cut through the moment. Is everything fine here? He scanned the table, his expression unreadable. Margaret's smile returned, smooth and sharp. And everyone waited for me to answer. Daniel's eyes fixed on me. Calm, unreadable, but sharp enough to cut. Margaret's hand rested lightly on his arm, like she owned the moment. Every guest stared, waiting for me to speak. The ballroom went still, only the faint clink of glass in the distance. I forced a breath. My heart pounded so loud, I barely heard my own voice. It's fine, I whispered, my lips dry. Margaret's smile widened, satisfied, as if I'd confirmed her truth. The tension tightened around my chest. But something in me stirred. A flicker, faint but real, beneath all the fear. I remembered Dad's words. The note laws you choose how they treat you. The paper felt alive in my memory, like a warning and a lifeline. My hands stopped trembling. Margaret raised her glass again, ready to toast. To Daniel, the provider. She began, her tone dripping sweet poison. To keeping this family afloat. The words rolled over me like ice water. I straightened in my chair. Margaret, I said quietly. The single word cut through her toast. She blinked, her smile faltering. Every head turned again. The chandelier light felt harsh, but I didn't look away. My voice stayed steady, though my pulse raced. Teaching isn't a hobby. It's a job. A purpose. And I don't owe anyone an apology for it. Each word felt heavier than the last. Margaret's lips tightened, her pearls catching the light. Daniel's jaw clenched, but he stayed silent. The woman in the sharp suit gave a slight nod, almost unseen. The guests shifted, murmuring softly. The balance in the room tilted just slightly. For the first time in months, I didn't shrink. The air felt different, charged, like the calm before a storm. Margaret's eyes narrowed, cold as polished steel. She leaned closer, whispering only for me. You'll regret this. Her perfume, thick and floral, hit my nose again. But this time, I didn't flinch. I met her stare unblinking. The hum of the chandelier above filled the silence. And then Daniel spoke. Claire. His voice low, measured. Are you trying to embarrass this family? The words hung heavy, slicing through the quiet. Every eye returned to me, waiting, and I had to choose my next breath carefully. The house was quiet when we returned. Too quiet. Daniel went upstairs without a word. Margaret's heels clicked toward her room. The sound faded, leaving only the hum of the fridge. I stood in the kitchen, coat still on. The scent of her heavy perfume lingered in the air. It clung to the curtains like smoke. I pulled out my phone, opened our banking app. My stomach sank before the numbers loaded. The screen glowed cold in the dim light. Our joint account, nearly empty. Last week, it held enough for 2 months' bills. Now, only a few hundred left. A dozen withdrawals, none of them mine. My fingers tapped the screen, scrolling fast. Every transaction felt like a slap. Luxury store, private club, a payment to a law firm. All under Daniel's name. My name sat silently at the bottom. I grabbed my laptop from the hall table. Set it on the counter, the sound of the latch snapping loud. The kitchen clock ticked louder now, each second sharp. I logged into the cloud folder Daniel never used. He didn't know I had the password. The files loaded slowly. Blue light from the screen painted the marble countertop. In the shared documents, one folder was new, titled Home improvements. Inside, a contract dated last week. My name sat in bold print. My signature scrawled at the bottom, except it wasn't mine. The ink looked off, thicker than my usual pen strokes. I touched the screen, my hand cold. The contract transferred property rights. Not just the house, but a plot of land my father gifted me. Signed away, sold, without my knowledge. The notary line was blank. Someone hadn't finished covering their tracks. I reached for the printer on the shelf. Pulled out the original copy, the ink still sharp. The faint smell of toner clung to the paper. I traced my forged name with my fingertip. My hands trembled, anger rising beneath the fear. I thought of Margaret's words at the party. Daniel provides. She manages. She'd known all along. Maybe even helped. My breath came shallow, quick. The heater clicked on, its hum filling the silence. I stared at the screen, then the paper, then back again. Every piece screamed betrayal, louder than her public insults ever could. The floor beneath my feet felt unsteady, like the whole house could tilt. My mind raced. Call Dad now. Confront Daniel. Or keep silent until I knew every detail. Each choice felt heavy, permanent. Then, a door upstairs creaked. Slow, deliberate steps came down the hall. I slid the paper beneath the laptop, pulse pounding. Daniel's shadow stretched long across the kitchen floor. Daniel's steps were slow, deliberate. The hardwood creaked beneath his weight. The kitchen lights hummed, casting a pale glow across the marble. I slid the contract beneath the laptop, fingers stiff. My pulse thudded in my ears. He paused in the doorway, sleeves rolled, tie gone. Why are you still up? His voice was even, but his eyes scanned the counter. I forced a breath, steadying my hands on the cool stone. Couldn't sleep. Just checking some grades. He stepped closer, the faint scent of whiskey trailing him. A glass clinked softly as he set it down. The cold air from the cracked window drifted in. It carried the faint sound of leaves scratching the patio. The silence felt heavier than his words. You seem tense at the party, he said casually. His fingers tapped the counter, rhythmic, deliberate. Margaret was just teasing. You can handle that, can't you? I swallowed, my throat tight. She does more than tease, Daniel. His eyes flicked to mine, brief but sharp. Then he smiled, a calm, empty curve. She just wants us to look our best. People notice when families aren't aligned. His tone softened. But the warning was clear. I traced the laptop edge with my thumb, hiding the tremor. Is that why our account's almost drained? The words slipped out before I could stop them. He froze, just a fraction, before lifting the glass again. Investments. Things you wouldn't understand. I forced a small nod. Didn't push. Didn't reveal what I'd found. Not yet. The contract's edges pressed against my wrist under the laptop. A reminder of how deep this went. He finished his drink, the ice clinking softly. Then he leaned closer, voice low. Claire, don't worry about finances. Focus on your job. Leave the rest to me. The words felt rehearsed, hollow. He turned, walking back toward the stairs. The sound of each step echoed, steady, confident. The house seemed to hold its breath until his door clicked shut. Only the hum of the fridge remained. And my pulse, still quick, still heavy. I pulled the contract out again. Laid it flat on the counter, the ink cold under my fingertips. The faint scent of toner lingered, mixing with the chill from the window. My reflection on the screen stared back, pale and tired. I whispered, "What are you planning, Daniel?" My phone buzzed on the counter. A message from Dad. AF, call when you can. Important. I stared at the screen, torn between fear and relief. If I called, everything could unravel tonight. If I waited, I could gather more. The heater clicked on, filling the silence with a low hum. I slipped the contract into a folder, tucking it deep in my bag. My breath steadied, slow, deliberate. I'd play along, at least for now. But tomorrow, I'd start pulling every thread loose. Rain tapped against the windows all morning. The gray sky hung low, heavy, like the air in the house. Margaret didn't leave her room. Daniel left before dawn, no note, no word. The silence felt sharper than any argument. I checked my phone. No texts, no calls, except from Leela. 19, bold, the only one who didn't treat me like furniture. Her message was simple of, "Are you okay?" I typed back, "I'm here." Just quiet. The quiet wasn't peace. It was isolation, stitched into every corner. Margaret handled the mail now. She forgot to leave my letters. Bills piled in a drawer I wasn't meant to open. Even my schedule at school shifted. Daniel spoke to the principal, called it a favor. More paperwork, fewer classes, fewer faces to talk to. I moved through each day like a ghost. The hallways echoed more than they used to. That night, I pulled out the quilt. Margaret had shoved it in the attic, but I found it. The fabric smelled faintly of lavender soap and dust. Each stitch felt like a lifeline, soft and steady. I wrapped it around my shoulders and sat in the dark. I remembered a drive to Burke 2 months earlier. Rain had been falling then, too. Dad's porch light glowed warm through the storm. His old radio hummed a soft jazz tune in the background. The scent of fresh coffee drifted through the screen door. He handed me a towel, then a mug. "Set," he said simply. The kitchen smelled of cedar and wet earth. The old lamp flickered, casting a gold halo across the table. He studied my face, quiet but sharp. "You're fading, Claire," he said softly. "Piece by piece. Can you feel it?" I nodded, though my throat felt tight. He slid a notepad toward me. On it, one line written in his steady hand. "Truth will corner them." The radio crackled as thunder rolled outside. I traced the ink with my fingertip. His hand covered mine, warm, steady. "When you're ready," he said, "call me first. Not after. First." Back in Fairfax, the heater kicked on. Its hum filled the dark room, faint but constant. I pulled the quilt tighter, the lavender scent grounding me. Margaret's footsteps echoed upstairs, slow, deliberate. The floorboards creaked, then stilled. A car door slammed outside. Daniel's return. Late, no headlights. I peeked through the curtain, heart quickening. His figure lingered by the trunk, moving something heavy. And I knew, whatever he was hiding, I'd need to find it first. The rain stopped by morning, but the driveway still smelled of wet asphalt and engine smoke. Daniel's truck was parked crooked, tailgate unlocked. A tarp covered something large, tied down with frayed rope. He didn't mention it at breakfast. Margaret watched me from the doorway. Her perfume, thick, floral, hung in the hall. She sipped her tea, eyes following every move. Daniel left early again, keys jangling sharp in the still air. The house felt colder once the door shut. I waited until the sound of her heels faded upstairs. Slipped outside, pulled the tarp back just enough. Underneath, a metal lockbox. Faint smell of paper and motor oil. Too heavy to lift alone, but not locked tight. Back inside, I searched his study. Drawers full of receipts, club invoices, half-signed documents. Everywhere smelled of ink and old leather. One folder held copies of checks, my forged signature again. Each page heavier than the last. A knock startled me. Quick, light, not Margaret's rhythm. I opened the side door to find Leela. Her hood dripped rain, her breath visible in the chill air. She glanced over her shoulder before stepping inside. "Aunt Claire," she whispered. "They're planning something big. Margaret told my dad Daniel's moving funds. She said you won't be a problem soon." Her hands shook as she held out a folded note. I overheard her. "You need to be careful." The note was a club schedule, circled dates in red. 2 days marked. Review assets. The ink smelled fresh, sharp. I folded it into my pocket, my pulse quickening. The kitchen clock ticked louder than before. "Stay with us tonight," she said. But I shook my head. If I vanished, they'd notice too soon. Better to watch, to know. Her worried eyes lingered, but she left without another word. The house dimmed as evening fell. Only the hallway lamp glowed, flickering with every gust outside. The radio in the den hummed static. Margaret never turned it off. The sound felt like a warning, constant and low. I sat at the table, quilt wrapped around my shoulders. Daniel's truck returned after dark. No headlights again, engine rumbling low. I stayed by the window, breath slow, steady. He unloaded the lockbox, carried it inside. Margaret met him in the hall, voices hushed. I reached for my phone. Dad's last message still on the screen. "Call when you can. Important." The faint buzz of the radio filled the silence. My thumb hovered over his number. And for the first time I was ready to press it. The hall smelled of wine and polished wood. Crystal chandeliers glared overhead, casting harsh light on every table. The murmur of voices rose and fell, broken by clinking glasses. Daniel led the way again, 2 steps ahead. Margaret followed close, pearls gleaming like trophies. I kept behind them, clutching my coat. The air felt heavy, like every stair pressed on my shoulders. A waiter brushed past, the scent of citrus and gin trailing behind. My heels clicked softly on the marble floor. Each sound echoed longer than it should. The meeting wasn't formal, not exactly. Local leaders, donors, a few familiar faces from Daniel's club. They gathered near the stage, papers in hand. Margaret wasted no time stepping into the center. Her voice carried over the hum, sharp and clear. "She's not exactly contributing," she said. A few heads turned toward me. Margaret gestured with her glass, calm and practiced. "Claire spends her hours in classrooms, while Daniel shoulders everything else. Appearance matters for families like ours." The words landed heavier than before. Not just a party. Not just her bridge group. Now it was in front of people who made decisions. Daniel stood beside her, silent, his eyes fixed on the stage. I felt the air thicken. The smell of wine turned sour in my throat. My hands tightened on my clutch, nails biting into the leather. Each breath came shallow, measured. A low hum from the chandelier filled the pauses. Across the room, near the back, a man adjusted his phone. Gray suit, simple tie, part of the city council. He didn't look up, but the phone's red light blinked faintly. Recording. His posture stayed neutral, almost invisible. Margaret kept going. She doesn't understand what Daniel sacrifices. She clings to small routines while he builds a future for us all. The pearls on her neck glimmered under the chandeliers, every word cut like glass. A few people nodded along, others glanced away, uncomfortable. I caught one woman's gaze, brief, sympathetic, then gone. Daniel shifted his weight, but said nothing. Not a word in my defense. The scent of lavender drifted faintly from Margaret's shawl. That same cloying sweetness she left everywhere. It clashed with the bitter tang of wine in the air. Each contrast made my stomach twist tighter. I felt the room closing in, inch by inch. Margaret raised her glass, voice louder now. "To Daniel, who carries this family with grace." A round of polite applause followed. My ears rang beneath the sound, and I could feel every eye turning my way. The applause faded, leaving a strange hush. Only the clink of glasses and shuffle of chairs broke it. The wine scent grew thicker, heavy, almost sour. I steadied myself, fingers tracing the seam of my clutch. Every muscle told me to stay quiet. Margaret's smile didn't falter. She leaned closer to a councilwoman, voice just loud enough. "Claire means well, but she doesn't exactly elevate the Brooks name." The councilwoman's brow creased, just slightly. Her eyes flicked toward me, cool and curious. A laugh rippled from somewhere near the bar. Short, nervous, not quite real. The sound made the chandelier hum seem louder. I swallowed, throat dry, the back of my neck burning. The urge to walk out clawed at me. Daniel adjusted his cufflinks, still silent. His gaze never once landed on me. He looked past Margaret, past the murmurs like none of it mattered. Or maybe like I didn't. The realization stung sharper than her words. Across the room, the man in the gray suit shifted. His phone stayed angled toward the floor, the red light steady. He murmured something to a colleague, then leaned back again. His face remained unreadable, distant. But he didn't stop recording. I caught a whisper behind me. "She's a teacher, right? Not exactly a crime." Two women near the buffet exchanged glances, brows furrowed. Even strangers could see the cruelty dripping from Margaret's tone. Margaret kept her pace, smooth and rehearsed. "She's kind, but appearances matter. Daniel's firm can't afford distractions at home." Her pearls shifted as she tilted her head, watching reactions. Every word carried weight, designed to land softly and cut deep. The lights seemed hotter above me. The scent of spilled wine near the bar made my stomach churn. Someone coughed into a napkin, the sound sharp in the quiet. I gripped my clutch tighter, knuckles whitening. A part of me wanted to shout, but another part said, "Not yet. Not here, not like this." Dad's voice echoed in my head, calm and measured. "When you're ready, call me first. Not after. First." I let my breath slow, each inhale steady, each exhale controlled. The councilwoman's gaze lingered again, curious now. Daniel checked his watch, frowning faintly. Margaret's glass tilted, catching the chandelier light. She turned back to the room, raising her voice. Margaret tapped her glass again. The sound sliced through the low chatter. Her smile stayed perfect, but her eyes glinted. "I suppose we can toast again. To those who truly carry the Brooks legacy." The chandelier light reflected off her pearls. Her perfume drifted heavy, a floral cloud that felt suffocating. She looked straight at me as she spoke. "Some of us build, others cling. Daniel deserves better than dead weight." A hush rippled across the room. The councilwoman near the stage shifted in her chair. Her fingers drummed softly on the table, disapproving. The man in the gray suit tilted his phone slightly. That faint red light kept blinking. Heat rose up my neck. Every instinct screamed to leave, to vanish into the cold night. But Dad's words echoed again, steady and firm. "Respect isn't optional. You choose how they treat you." I straightened my shoulders. The wine scent, the perfume, the bright lights, none of it mattered now. I cleared my throat, the sound sharper than I expected. Every head turned, the hum of the chandelier filling the pause. Margaret's smile faltered, just slightly. "Margaret," I said evenly. My voice didn't shake. "You seem more interested in appearances than truth tonight. Maybe we should talk about what Daniel's been signing." The room stilled, a collective inhale. Margaret's eyes widened for a flash, then narrowed fast. Daniel's head snapped toward me, his jaw tight. The murmurs started, soft but growing. Across the room, the gray-suited man adjusted his tie. His phone angled higher, still recording. Margaret's pearls clicked softly as she turned to Daniel. "She's being dramatic," she hissed. Her hand trembled just enough to make her wine ripple. Daniel didn't answer. His silence was louder than any denial. I let the quiet stretch. The tension wrapped around the room like a rope. Some guests leaned forward, others whispered behind raised hands. The councilwoman's gaze met mine, steady and knowing. She reached into her bag, slipping out a notepad. Margaret forced a laugh, brittle and thin. "Well, isn't this awkward? Claire, Dear, let's not bore our friends with nonsense. Her voice lost its sweetness for the first time all night. And for once, no one laughed with her. The chandelier buzzed faintly above, filling the silence. The councilwoman set her pen down, eyes on me now. Across the room, the man in gray sent a quick text. Margaret's glass tipped slightly, her hand still unsteady. And I knew the tide was finally turning. Would you have spoken up? Or stayed silent to keep the peace? Tell me below. Your choice says more than you think. The house was dark when we returned. Daniel went straight to his study, no word spoken. Margaret disappeared upstairs, heels clicking, perfume trailing behind. Only the hum of the fridge and the wind outside filled the space. The silence felt alive, almost watching. I slipped off my heels, padded to the kitchen. The hall light flickered, casting long, thin shadows across the floor. The faint scent of damp leaves drifted through the cracked window. I pulled the lockbox key from my coat pocket. Leela had slipped it to me earlier, whispering, "Check tonight." In Daniel's study, the air was colder. The desk lamp glowed a dull amber, shadows stretching along the shelves. The smell of old paper and leather hung heavy. I opened the bottom drawer, slow and careful. The lock clicked softly, like it wanted to betray me. Inside, files stacked in neat piles. Property transfers, signed contracts, bank slips, all with my name forged. Each page smelled faintly of fresh toner, the edges still warm. At the bottom, a thin envelope marked, "Club Council." The seal was broken, contents already copied. I skimmed the letter, my chest tightening. Margaret and Daniel had arranged a private hearing. 2 days away. My consent, already noted in the documents. They were planning to shift every asset before I could react. The floorboard outside creaked. I froze, clutching the drawer edge. The hallway light flickered again, shadows stretching and twisting. Then, only silence. I shut the drawer, locked it, held my breath. Back in the kitchen, I spotted a folded paper near the door. Not from Leela. A different hand, sharper strokes. "Keep copies. Watch the hall camera." On no signature, but I knew the handwriting. Dad's, steady, deliberate. The note smelled faintly of cedar, like his study. He had been here. Somehow, quietly, without anyone noticing. I tucked the paper into my coat, pulse quickening. The wind outside howled against the window pane. Upstairs, a door slammed. Margaret's voice rose, muffled through the walls. Daniel's deeper tone followed, low and sharp. I couldn't catch the words, but the tension cut through the air. I eased toward the back door, coat in hand. The porch light buzzed overhead, casting a faint halo. The yard smelled of wet soil and gasoline from the truck. In the distance, I caught a glint of headlights down the street. Too still to be random. Someone was watching, waiting, and I couldn't tell yet. Were they here to help? Or to make sure I stayed silent? Leela returned after midnight. She tapped twice on the kitchen window, her hood dripping rain. I unlocked the door fast, pulling her inside. The hallway light flickered again, buzzing faintly like static. It made every sound feel sharper. We spread the files across the counter. Pages of forged contracts, bank transfers, property deeds. The smell of fresh toner lingered, sharp and cold. Leela's fingers trembled as she sorted the papers. "They're moving everything, Aunt Claire. Fast." The printer in Daniel's study whirred once. A single page slid out, faint blue light glowing from the machine. We froze, listening for footsteps. Only the wind rattled the back door. I slipped the page into our growing stack. We scanned each document with my phone. The faint shutter sound felt too loud in the quiet. Outside, wind pushed the shutters against the siding, a hollow thud. Leela glanced at the window, her eyes wide. "I swear someone's out there," she whispered. I checked the porch. The yard was empty, but the street lamp flickered. A parked sedan idled across the road, headlights off. The faint hum of its engine carried on the wind. Not a neighbor's car. Not this late. Back inside, we stacked the files neatly, each copy sealed in a plastic sleeve from my school supplies. The smell of paper and plastic filled the room. Leela wiped her hands on her jeans, her voice low. What if they find out we took these? I reached for my coat, felt something in the pocket. Another note, folded small, same cedar scent as before, same sharp handwriting. Drive east. Barn at Willow Road. First light. No name, but it didn't need one. Leela exhaled, relieved. Your dad. I nodded once. He's already 2 steps ahead. The hallway light buzzed again, a faint pop before it went dark. The fridge hummed louder in the silence. Somewhere upstairs, a floorboard creaked. Margaret's voice murmured something, too soft to catch. The sound of Daniel's door shutting followed, firm and final. We didn't move, barely breathing. Leela gathered the last folder. Her hands shook as she tucked it into her backpack. We can't stay here, Aunt Claire. Not tonight. The wind howled harder, rattling the window panes. And from the porch, a shadow crossed the flickering light. The porch light flickered again, buzzing like a trapped insect. Outside, the wind carried the scent of wet asphalt and pine. Leela clutched her backpack, her knuckles white. We need to leave now, she whispered. I nodded, pulling my coat tighter. We eased toward the back door. The hallway was dark, the overhead bulb finally burnt out. Each floorboard creaked under our weight, loud in the silence. Upstairs, Margaret's faint laugh drifted from her room. It didn't sound amused, it sounded knowing. The driveway was empty, but too quiet. Even the street seemed still, no passing cars, no voices. Leela's breath fogged in the cold air. I reached for my keys, but froze. Headlights flashed once, down the road. A black SUV idled near the corner. Its engine purred low, steady, controlled. Not Daniel's truck, not a neighbor. One headlight blinked twice, paused, then once more. A signal, deliberate and familiar. Leela's eyes widened. That's him, isn't it? I nodded slowly, my pulse steadying. The cedar-scented notes made sense now. Dad was close, closer than I'd thought. A shadow stepped from the driver's side. Tall, broad-shouldered. Posture unmistakable even in the dim light. He didn't wave, didn't call out. Instead, he pointed toward the end of the street, the old barn on Willow Road. Behind us, a floorboard groaned. The sound came from inside the house, near the study. Daniel's door opened, slow and deliberate. Light spilled across the hallway, stretching toward the stairs. Leela grabbed my hand, her grip firm. We slipped into the SUV's beam just as it dimmed. The faint smell of leather and pine drifted as the door opened. Inside, no words, only a folder on the seat, marked, Club Hearing. The ink on the cover was still fresh, still wet. Dad's work, precise and quiet. The SUV engine hummed low, ready to move. Leela slid in first, clutching the backpack of copies. I hesitated, glancing back at the house one last time. Daniel's shadow crossed the upstairs window, still searching. His face caught in the faint porch glow. The door behind us creaked open. Margaret's voice floated into the cold air. Claire, you're making a mistake. Her tone was calm, almost sweet, but the chill in it made my skin crawl. The SUV headlights brightened, cutting through the dark. Dad's silhouette climbed back into the driver's seat. The engine revved once, a low, steady growl. And before Margaret stepped closer, we were gone. Straight toward the barn and whatever waited there. The barn smelled of old wood and damp straw. Wind whistled through the cracks, rattling loose boards. Headlights from the SUV cut faint beams through the dusty air. Leela stayed close, clutching the backpack tight. I pulled my coat tighter, feeling the cold in my bones. Dad stood near a workbench, posture straight, steady. Two men in dark uniforms flanked him, silent, watching the shadows. A single lantern flickered on the table, casting long, jagged lines. The smell of motor oil and cold metal mixed with the damp. It felt like a battlefield, quiet before the move. He slid a folder across the table. Thick, heavy, sealed with a red tag. Inside copies of every contract, transfer, and forged signature. City Council meets tomorrow, Dad said. Margaret and Daniel will be there, expecting silence. Leela placed her backpack beside it. Our copies, she said softly. Her voice shook, but her hands didn't. Dad nodded, his gray eyes sharp, unblinking. They don't get to erase you, Claire. Not anymore. I touched the folder, fingers brushing the cold paper edges. The faint scent of cedar from Dad's coat steadied me. Will this be enough? I asked quietly. Dad's jaw tightened, his tone calm. It's already in the council's hands. Tomorrow is just the reveal. The lantern flickered as a gust pushed through the barn. Loose hay rustled near the door, the boards groaning faintly. One of the officers stepped closer, scanning the dark outside. Truck passing, he murmured, voice low, controlled. His hand rested casually near his belt. Dad leaned closer, his voice even quieter. You'll stand with me, Claire. Not to fight. To be seen. They can't twist what's on record. His hand rested briefly over mine, firm, grounding. Leela exhaled, her breath visible in the cold air. They'll know it's coming, won't they? Dad nodded once. They'll suspect. But by the time they react, it'll be done. The lantern light caught the steel in his eyes. Outside, tires crunched on gravel. Slow, deliberate, stopping just beyond the tree line. The faint glow of headlights cut through the mist. Not Daniel's truck this time. Smaller, lower, moving quiet. The officers exchanged a glance, subtle but sharp. Dad's voice stayed calm. Stay behind me, both of you. This might not be them. And if it is, they won't leave happy. The lantern flickered again, shadows stretching long across the barn walls. The headlights outside dimmed, then cut completely. Only the faint glow of the lantern lit the barn walls. The wind carried the sound of car doors opening. 2, maybe 3, muted thuds on the gravel. Leela's grip on my arm tightened. Dad didn't move fast. He glanced toward the officers, a silent nod. One stepped to the barn door, peered through the gap. 3 men, he whispered. No lights, no sound. Moving slow. The boards creaked under a heavier gust. The smell of damp hay mixed with cold air. My heart thudded against my ribs, loud in the quiet. Leela's breath came shallow, fogging faintly in the lantern glow. Dad's expression never shifted. He stepped forward, his boots deliberate, slow. The lantern light caught the sharp lines of his face. When he spoke, his voice stayed calm, even, gentleman. He called, not raising it. This isn't the night for mistakes. Silence answered at first. Then, the faint crunch of a step closer. One figure stopped just outside the door, shadowed. You shouldn't be here, Colonel, a voice said. Low. Smooth, but strained around the edges. Dad didn't blink. Neither should you, he replied evenly. You have 30 seconds to turn that car around. Council meets tomorrow. Nothing you do tonight changes that. The officers didn't draw weapons. They didn't need to. Their posture, quiet and solid, filled the barn with tension. One rested his hand lightly on the doorframe. Another shifted, blocking the view of the documents. A long pause followed. The wind whistled through the gaps, rattling the loose boards. Then, a muttered curse from outside. The gravel crunched again. Retreat this time, not approach. Car doors slammed, one by one. The engine started, low and distant. The sound faded into the night, tires hissing along the wet road. The barn settled back into silence. save for the lantern's faint buzz. Leela's shoulders eased, her grip loosening on my arm. I exhaled for the first time in minutes. Dad turned to me, his tone unchanged. They'll try again in the morning. But they'll do it where everyone can see, which is exactly what we want. He gestured to the folder on the bench. The lantern flickered, shadows stretching long again. Somewhere far off, thunder rolled over the hills. The officers exchanged another quiet glance. And in the distance, another engine rumbled. This one growing louder, heading straight toward us. The rumble grew closer, steady, controlled. Headlights swept through the barn slats, bright but deliberate. The scent of wet pine drifted in as the wind shifted. Leela stood still, clutching her pack. I stepped closer to Dad, breath slow, measured. A dark sedan rolled into view. No sudden movements, no sound beyond the soft hum of the engine. The driver's door opened, a tall man stepping out. His coat carried the faint scent of rain and tobacco. Not Margaret's people. This was someone prepared. He nodded once at Dad, nothing more, then popped the trunk, revealing 2 sealed cases. Each bore the council's seal in silver. Stacks of reports, witness statements, and every file we'd gathered. Evidence, neat and irrefutable. Confirmed for tomorrow, the man said. His voice was low, even, like the hum of the sedan. The council session is locked. Media will be there. They can't bury this now. Dad's hand rested briefly on my shoulder. His grip was steady, grounding. You won't need to speak much, Claire. But they'll see you stand there. And they'll know what they tried to erase. Lila exhaled, her shoulders easing for the first time all night. Her breath fogged in the cold air. We're really doing this, she whispered. Her fingers traced the zipper of her pack. Every copy we'd made safe inside. I glanced at the cases in the trunk. The scent of ink and paper drifted faintly as the wind shifted. Each page felt like a weight lifted, a piece of myself reclaimed. But the knot in my chest didn't loosen yet. Tomorrow would make it final. Or tear it apart. The sedan's headlights dimmed, leaving only the lantern glow. Outside, the woods groaned softly under the wind. An owl hooted once in the distance, sharp against the quiet. The officers checked the road, silent, deliberate. Dad's gaze never left the cases. They'll arrive early, he said calmly. They'll try one last time to twist it. Ignore every word. The truth's louder than they are. His tone was steady, final. I pulled the quilt tighter around my shoulders. Its lavender scent steadied my breath in the damp air. Beyond the barn, clouds shifted, letting the moonlight spill in. The light cut long silver lines across the dirt floor. And tomorrow I'd have to stand under brighter lights. Rain tapped softly on the windows. The sound felt calm now, not heavy like before. My new apartment smelled of lemon soap and fresh paint. The quilt lay folded at the end of my bed. Its lavender scent drifted faintly through the quiet air. The council session was behind me. Margaret and Daniel left the chamber without a word. Their names, their signatures, their lies laid bare in front of everyone. I didn't have to shout or argue. I just stood there, letting the truth speak louder. Now the silence felt different. No heavy footsteps on the stairs. No perfume hanging in the hall. Only the hum of the heater and the soft patter of rain. For the first time in years, the quiet felt safe. I poured a cup of chamomile tea. The steam curled upward, carrying its soft floral scent. The lamp on the table glowed warm, casting gold light on the walls. My phone buzzed. A message from Leela. You did it. Proud of you. At the shelter, the halls smelled of coffee and laundry soap. Women moved quietly through the rooms, some with children in tow. Their voices carried the same edge mine once had. Tired. Uncertain. I sat with a woman named Brooke in the kitchen. She stirred her tea, hands trembling. She says I'm nothing without him, Brooke whispered. Her eyes stayed fixed on the steam rising from her cup. I touched her hand, steady and calm. You're more than what he tells you. I know, because I used to believe the same. She met my gaze, her eyes wet but steadying. We sat in silence for a moment, letting the tea steam rise between us. Outside, the rain slowed, the sound soft against the windows. The quilt's lavender scent clung to my jacket, grounding me. Every stitch felt like a reminder I wasn't gone, I was whole. Later, back in my apartment, I opened the window. Cool air swept in, smelling faintly of rain and distant pine. The city lights glimmered softly in the distance, muted by the drizzle. I traced the quilt's faded patterns, each square a thread of survival. And for the first time, I felt steady enough to look forward. The email came on a quiet morning. Steam curled from my tea as I opened it. A women's leadership group wanted me to speak. A workshop on resilience, recovery, and finding your voice. For a moment, I just stared at the screen. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. Part of me wondered if I was ready. Another part knew I couldn't turn away. Not after everything. I typed a simple reply of yes. Tell me when and where. The phone rang just after. Dad's name lit the screen, steadied and familiar. His voice carried that calm weight I'd leaned on for months. You're not just surviving anymore, Claire, he said. You're showing others how to do it. I glanced at the quilt draped over the couch. Its lavender scent mingled with the faint aroma of tea. Every stitch felt like a promise passed through generations. Legacy isn't what they tried to take, I said softly. It's what we build now. Dad's chuckle was low, warm. You sound like your grandmother. She used to say strength was something you hand down, not something you hoard. I smiled, hearing the echo of her voice in his. Outside, the clouds broke, letting sunlight filter through. The light caught the steam rising from my cup. For the first time in months, the world didn't feel so heavy. Even the silence in my apartment felt alive, not empty. It carried a sense of beginning, not loss. That evening, I walked through the shelter halls again. The scent of coffee and detergent filled the air. A group of women gathered in the rec room, their voices low. One of them looked up as I passed. You're the one from the council hearing, right? I nodded, pausing in the doorway. Her eyes lit with something I recognized. Hope, small but real. I sat beside her, feeling the quiet hum of connection. We didn't speak much at first. Sometimes silence says more than words. When I left, the sun was setting over Richmond. The sky glowed soft orange, fading to blue near the horizon. I walked home slowly, the quilt folded over my arm. The air smelled of rain and warm pavement. And for once, the path ahead didn't feel uncertain. The workshop hall smelled faintly of fresh coffee and lemon cleaner. Rows of chairs filled slowly, voices low but eager. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, warming the polished wood floor. I stood near the podium, my hands resting on the quilt. Its lavender scent steadied my breath. The microphone crackled softly as I adjusted it. The quiet in the room deepened, like everyone was holding a breath. I scanned the faces, women of all ages, some smiling, some guarded. Their eyes carried stories I recognized, stories of being diminished, ignored, or erased. I began with a pause. I thought silence was survival, I said. The words felt heavy but sure. I thought if I stayed small I'd stay safe. But staying small cost me more than I knew. The room stayed silent, except for the soft hum of the lights. I continued, voice steady but low. Strength isn't about shouting louder. It's about standing steady, even when they try to erase you. It's about choosing to be seen. A few heads nodded, slow and deliberate. I unfolded the quilt. draping it over the edge of the podium. This quilt outlasted everything they tried to take. It outlasted lies, signatures, and a house I no longer call home. It reminds me every day. I'm still here. Afterward, Dad waited by the doors. His coat smelled faintly of cedar and rain. He didn't say much, just placed a hand on my shoulder. "You stood steady," he said softly. "And you handed someone else a reason to do the same." I looked back at the women gathering near the podium. Some traced the quilt stitches, others whispered softly to one another. Their voices carried something different now. Less fear, more resolve. The scent of coffee drifted from the back table, warm and grounding. It felt like a beginning, not an ending. On the walk home, the streets glistened from a light drizzle. Street lamps reflected off the wet pavement, casting gold trails. I wrapped the quilt around my shoulders, its warmth familiar. Each step felt like moving further from survival, closer to living. And I knew I wasn't alone anymore. If you've ever been pushed aside, erased, or silenced, your story doesn't end there. Share it below so someone else can find their strength. And if you're ready for more voices like this, stay close. We're stronger when we speak together. Claire's story doesn't end in the council chamber or at the workshop podium. It ends where it truly began, inside her, when she chose to stop shrinking. Through every forged signature, every public humiliation, every cold night under someone else's roof, she realized one thing: survival isn't enough. True healing begins when you reclaim your own space, your own name, and your own strength. It doesn't come from revenge or shouting louder than those who tried to erase you. It comes from standing steady, holding your ground, and letting the truth do the work. Claire didn't fight with fists or anger. She fought with quiet proof, unshakable allies, and the courage to stand in the open. And in doing so, she built a legacy, not of property or titles, but of resilience. One she now passes on to every woman she meets, every life she touches at the shelter. Because sometimes, the most powerful justice is simply showing the world you can't be erased. And the most lasting legacy is helping others find their way back to themselves, one steady step at a time.